This story is inspired by real-life events, contains fictional elements, and is not suitable for viewers under the age of 18.
On a rainy October evening in Seattle, Jonathan Carter discovered two things within the same hour: that his wife was in love with another man, and that the man was his best friend. What Jonathan did next was not rage, not violence, and not forgiveness. It was something far more devastating. Seattle in early October always carried the scent of rain and coffee. The streets shone under the glow of street lamps, reflecting the glass towers that rose above the city like silent witnesses to the lives unfolding beneath them. Inside one of those towers, on the 23rd floor of a sleek architectural firm overlooking Elliott Bay, Jonathan Carter leaned over a drafting table, adjusting the final lines of a residential design. He worked slowly, carefully. Precision was not just a professional habit, it was the way he lived his life. At 36 years old, Jonathan had built a quiet reputation as one of Seattle's most reliable architects. He was not flamboyant like some of the younger designers in the office, but clients trusted him. His buildings were elegant, balanced, and thoughtful, much like the man himself. The office was nearly empty. Most of his colleagues had already gone home hours earlier. Jonathan checked the time, 7:30 in the evening. Sophia would probably still be at the marketing firm downtown. Lately, she had been staying late more often, working on a major campaign for a luxury hotel chain. He rubbed his eyes and began packing his laptop. Outside, the rain had intensified into a steady curtain. When he stepped onto the street, the cold air struck his face with a familiar sharpness. Seattle nights always felt a little lonely, but tonight that loneliness felt heavier than usual. He wasn't sure why. The drive home took 20 minutes. Their house stood in a quiet neighborhood in Ballard, a modern two-story home with clean white walls and wide windows, one of Jonathan's own designs from several years earlier. It had once symbolized everything he and Sophia dreamed of building together. Now it felt quieter. Jonathan unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the kitchen light. Sophia stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone. She looked up briefly. "Hey," she said. Her tone was casual, almost distracted. Jonathan set his keys on the table. "Hey, I thought you were working late." "I finished early," she shrugged. "Client meeting got canceled." Sophia Carter was still strikingly beautiful. At 32, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who understood the power of appearance. Her long, dark hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and even in a simple sweater, she looked like someone who belonged in a lifestyle magazine. But lately, Jonathan had begun noticing small things. The distance in her voice, the way she often seemed elsewhere, even when standing in the same room. He walked into the kitchen and kissed her cheek. She smelled faintly of expensive perfume. "Dinner?" he asked. "I already ate with some coworkers." Jonathan paused. "Oh." A small silence settled between them. It wasn't the first time. Sophia returned her attention to her phone, smiling faintly at something on the screen. Jonathan opened the refrigerator, pretending to search for something to eat, while his mind quietly registered the moment. "Busy day?" he asked. "Always." Another pause. Then she said casually, "Michael called earlier." Jonathan looked up. "Michael?" "Yeah, he's back in town." Michael Hayes. The name carried years of history. Jonathan and Michael had met during their first year of college in Boston. Michael had been the loud, charismatic business student who seemed to know everyone on campus within weeks. Jonathan had been the quieter architecture major who preferred sketching buildings to attending parties. Despite their differences, they had become close friends. Over the years, Michael had built a successful tech consulting company and traveled constantly between cities. Whenever he visited Seattle, the three of them usually met for dinner. Sophia leaned back against the counter. "He wants to grab drinks this weekend," she said. Jonathan smiled faintly. "That sounds like Michael." She laughed softly. "He's fun." Jonathan nodded. "Yes, he is." But something in the way she said it lingered in his mind. Not jealousy, not suspicion, just a subtle note he couldn't quite place. Later that night, after Sophia went upstairs, Jonathan remained in the living room, reviewing blueprints on his laptop. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. At one point, he glanced toward the staircase. Sophia's voice drifted faintly from the bedroom. She was on the phone. Her tone sounded lighter than it had downstairs, almost playful. Jonathan tried not to listen. He returned to his work. But a few minutes later, he heard something that made his fingers stop on the keyboard. Sophia laughed. It was a laugh he hadn't heard in a long time. Warm, excited, alive. Jonathan closed his laptop slowly. For a brief moment, a strange thought crossed his mind. It disappeared just as quickly, because the idea that his wife might be hiding something from him felt impossible. Upstairs, the bedroom door closed. The house fell quiet again. Jonathan sat alone in the dim light of the living room, unaware that the foundation of his marriage had already begun to crack. And somewhere else in Seattle, Michael Hayes was smiling at a message on his phone. Seattle's social circles were smaller than most people imagine.
People believed large American cities allowed anonymity, but in certain professional worlds, architecture, tech, marketing, venture capital, the same faces appeared again and again at charity galas, business mixers, rooftop parties, and art exhibitions. That was the world Michael Hayes thrived in, and the world Sophia Carter had always wanted to belong to. Michael arrived in Seattle on a Thursday evening. His black Porsche slid into the driveway of Jonathan and Sophia's house just after 7. The engine hummed softly before shutting off, leaving the quiet neighborhood wrapped again in the sound of distant rain. Jonathan opened the door before Michael even reached it. "Look who finally decided to visit." Michael grinned. "Come on, man. You know I always come back." They embraced with the familiar ease of two men who had shared years of history, late nights in college dorms, cheap beer, ambitious conversations about the future. Michael stepped inside and glanced around. "Still the same house," he said. "Still looks like it belongs in an architecture magazine." Jonathan smiled modestly. "It's functional." Michael laughed. "You designed a luxury modern house overlooking half of Ballard, and you call it functional." Before Jonathan could reply, Sophia appeared from the hallway. For a brief second, Michael paused. Sophia wore a simple black dress, but the way she carried herself turned it into something far more striking. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and the warm kitchen light reflected in her dark eyes. "Sophia," Michael said, spreading his arms dramatically. "Seattle just got significantly more beautiful." She laughed. "You haven't changed." "That's a compliment, right?" "Depends." Jonathan watched them exchange the easy banter. Nothing unusual. Michael had always been like this, charming, theatrical, the kind of man who made every room feel slightly more alive. They ordered Thai food and opened a bottle of wine. At first, the conversation stayed harmless. Old college stories, Jonathan's latest architectural project, Sophia's marketing campaigns. But gradually, as the evening stretched longer, the rhythm shifted. Michael spoke about his life in San Francisco, private investor meetings, luxury hotels, networking events with tech founders and venture capitalists. Sophia listened with bright curiosity. "You meet all those people?" she asked. "Every week," Michael said casually. "The tech world is basically a traveling circus." "That sounds exciting." Jonathan smiled faintly from across the table. Michael leaned back in his chair. "It has its moments." Sophia tilted her head. "I feel like my job is just PowerPoint presentations and brand guidelines." "You work in marketing," Michael said. "You shape how people see the world." She laughed. "Nice way to make it sound more glamorous than it is." Michael lifted his glass slightly toward her. "Trust me, glamour is 90% marketing." Jonathan noticed the way Sophia smiled at that. It wasn't inappropriate, but there was an energy between them that hadn't been there before. He told himself he was imagining it. Over the following weeks, Michael became a frequent visitor. Sometimes Jonathan invited him, sometimes Sophia did. Other times, Michael simply texted, "In the neighborhood. Drinks?" Jonathan didn't mind. Michael had been his friend for nearly 2 decades. But slowly, almost invisibly, something began shifting. One Friday evening, Jonathan had to stay late at the office finishing a proposal. Sophia texted him around 6. "Michael invited me to a rooftop bar downtown. Is that okay?" Jonathan stared at the message for a moment, then typed, "Of course. Have fun." He returned to his work. Meanwhile, downtown Seattle glittered beneath a cool autumn sky.
Sophia stepped onto the rooftop terrace of the bar overlooking the harbor. The place pulsed with soft music and laughter.
Michael was already there, leaning casually against the railing. He turned when he saw her. "Well," he said with a smile, "I was starting to think you'd cancel." Sophia approached. Jonathan had to work late. Michael ordered drinks for them. The bartender placed 2 cocktails on the counter. Sophia looked out over the city lights. "I forget how beautiful Seattle is from up here." Michael studied her quietly. "You should come out more. Jonathan prefers quiet evenings." "And you?" She hesitated. "I don't know." Michael lifted his glass. "To discovering things we don't know." Their glasses touched. A small sound. But somehow the moment lingered. Over the next several weeks, their conversations began moving beyond casual gatherings. It started with messages, at first harmless. Michael: "Saw a restaurant you'd love." Sophia: "Send the address." Later, Sophia: "Jonathan's working again tonight."
What are you doing?
And eventually, "You deserve more fun than architecture drawings and quiet dinners." Sophia stared at that message longer than she should have. Then she typed, "Maybe." Jonathan noticed small changes. Sophia seemed more energetic lately, more careful with her appearance. She spent longer choosing outfits. Her phone rarely left her hand. One evening while they were watching television, a message notification lit up her screen. Just for a moment. Jonathan didn't mean to read it, but he caught the name. Michael Hayes. Sophia quickly turned the phone over. "Work stuff," she said casually. Jonathan nodded, but a faint unease settled somewhere in his chest. Meanwhile, Michael had grown bolder. One night, after a networking event, he and Sophia walked along the waterfront. Cold air drifted in from the bay. Sophia hugged her coat around herself. Michael stopped near the railing. "You ever feel like you're meant for something bigger?" he asked. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Your life," he said. "Does it feel exciting enough?" Sophia laughed quietly. "You're asking dangerous questions." "Maybe." The wind lifted a strand of her hair. Michael reached out and brushed it away from her face. The gesture was small, but electric. Sophia didn't move away. For several seconds they simply stood there, the sound of water moving quietly beneath the pier. Then Sophia stepped back. "We should go," she said softly. But that night, long after she returned home and Jonathan had fallen asleep, her phone vibrated. A message from Michael. "I can't stop thinking about that moment." Sophia stared at the screen, her heart beating faster. She typed, "Erased." Typed again. Finally, she sent, "Me neither." And somewhere deep inside the fragile structure of Jonathan Carter's marriage, the first real fracture appeared. Rain had always been part of Jonathan Carter's life. In Seattle, rain was not a storm. It was a constant presence, soft, persistent, patient. It soaked slowly into the ground, into the streets, into the bones of the city. Jonathan often thought relationships were similar. They rarely collapsed in one dramatic moment. They eroded quietly, one drop at a time. At first, the changes in Sophia were almost invisible. A late night here, a distracted reply there, small things that could easily be explained away by work stress or fatigue. Jonathan was not the kind of man who searched for problems where none existed. His mind preferred structure, logic, evidence. But something about the rhythm of their life had shifted. And once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing. One Wednesday evening, Jonathan came home earlier than usual. The house was empty. Sophia had texted earlier saying she had a client dinner. Jonathan reheated leftovers and ate alone at the kitchen island, scrolling through emails. After dinner, he opened his laptop and worked for another hour. At 9:15, Sophia still wasn't home. Jonathan checked his phone. No new messages. He hesitated, then typed, "Everything going okay?" The reply came 10 minutes later. "Yeah, just finishing dessert with the client." Jonathan stared at the message. It sounded normal, but something about it felt rehearsed. He closed the phone and tried to return to his work, yet a strange unease lingered. Sophia finally returned home close to 11. She stepped inside quietly, slipping off her heels near the door. Jonathan looked up from the couch. "You're late." She smiled faintly. "Dinner ran long." "Good meeting?" "Yeah." She moved into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Jonathan noticed she didn't meet his eyes. "Who was the client?" he asked casually. Sophia paused for a fraction of a second. "Hotel group," she said. "The Bellevue project." Jonathan nodded. He knew the project, but something in her tone sounded slightly off, as if the answer had been selected rather than remembered. Still, he said nothing. The following weekend, Michael Hayes invited them to a small gathering at a lounge downtown. Jonathan almost declined. He had deadlines approaching. But Sophia insisted. "You work too much," she said. "It's just one evening." So they went. The lounge was dimly lit, filled with quiet music and clusters of well-dressed professionals talking over cocktails. Michael stood near the bar when they arrived. His face brightened immediately when he saw them. "Well, if it isn't my favorite married couple." He hugged Jonathan first, then Sophia. Jonathan noticed something small. Michael's hand lingered on Sophia's back just a moment longer than necessary. Probably nothing. Still, Jonathan's mind recorded it. Throughout the evening, Michael and Sophia talked frequently. At first, Jonathan joined them, but later he found himself drifting into other conversations, an investor curious about architectural design, a developer discussing waterfront zoning permits. Every so often, he glanced across the room. Sophia was laughing. Michael leaned close to say something. Too close. Jonathan felt something strange twist in his chest. Not quite jealousy, more like awareness. On the drive home that night, the rain fell heavily against the windshield. Sophia scrolled through her phone. Jonathan kept his eyes on the road. "You and Michael seem to get along well," he said. Sophia looked up. "He's your friend." "Yeah." A short pause. "He's interesting," she added. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yes." The car filled with the quiet hum of the engine. Neither spoke for several minutes. Over the next weeks, the patterns grew clearer. Sophia's phone was almost always face down now. She carried it from room to room. Sometimes Jonathan would walk into the kitchen and see her quickly closing a message thread. One evening, he entered the bedroom unexpectedly. Sophia was texting. The moment she saw him, she locked the screen. "Work?" Jonathan asked. "Yeah," she replied. But Jonathan caught the brief flicker of nervousness in her eyes. Then came the first real crack in the illusion. It happened on a Monday afternoon. Jonathan was leaving a construction meeting when his phone buzzed. A notification from social media. Michael Hayes had posted a photo. Jonathan opened it absent-mindedly. The image showed the interior of a stylish downtown restaurant. Across the table sat a woman. The camera angle hid most of her face, but Jonathan recognized the bracelet on her wrist immediately. He had given it to Sophia on their anniversary 2 years earlier. Jonathan stared at the image. The caption read, "Great conversation tonight." The photo disappeared less than 5 minutes later. Deleted. Jonathan sat in his car, staring at his phone long after the screen had gone dark. Maybe it wasn't Sophia. Bracelets were common. Restaurants were crowded. People met friends all the time. There were countless innocent explanations. Jonathan repeated those explanations to himself the entire drive home. Yet something deep inside him had already shifted. Because once suspicion enters a marriage, it changes everything. That night, Sophia came home around 10. Jonathan was sitting in the living room reading. She kissed his cheek lightly. "Long day?" "Yeah." Jonathan looked at her carefully. Her makeup was slightly smudged. Her hair smelled faintly of a perfume she didn't usually wear. He closed the book slowly. "Where were you tonight?" Sophia hesitated. "Work dinner?" Jonathan held her gaze. "For the Bellevue project?" She blinked. "Yes." The lie came quickly, too quickly. Jonathan felt something cold settle in his chest. For the first time in their marriage, he realized something terrifying. His wife might be lying to him. Later that night, after Sophia fell asleep, Jonathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The rain tapped steadily against the windows. His mind replayed every strange moment from the past several weeks. The late nights, the secret messages, the photograph, and Michael, his best friend. Jonathan closed his eyes. He didn't want to believe it. But a quiet voice inside him whispered a possibility he had never considered before. What if the two people he trusted most in the world were the ones betraying him? The thought stayed with him long after midnight, growing heavier, more real. And somewhere in the darkness of that Seattle night, Jonathan Carter felt the first true shadow of betrayal enter his life. Suspicion changes the way a person sees the world. Before doubt enters a marriage, everyday life moves with quiet certainty. Words are trusted, smiles are believed. Silence means nothing more than fatigue or distraction. But once suspicion takes root, everything begins to carry a second meaning. Every message, every late night, every unexplained smile. For Jonathan Carter, the change happened slowly over the course of several weeks after the photograph incident. At first, he tried to dismiss it. He told himself he was overthinking things. Sophia had always been independent. Marketing often meant client dinners and late networking events. Michael had always been charismatic and social. Nothing about those facts automatically meant betrayal. And yet, Jonathan had spent his life designing structures. He understood foundations better than most people. When something begins to crack, the signs appear long before the collapse. The next sign came on a Thursday afternoon. Jonathan had left the office early after a construction meeting downtown. As he walked toward the parking garage, he noticed a familiar black Porsche parked along the street. Michael's Porsche. Jonathan slowed slightly. Michael often visited Seattle, but he rarely mentioned where he went during the day. Usually their meetings happened in the evening. Jonathan glanced toward the building beside the car. It was a small, upscale restaurant, quiet, discreet, popular with business professionals who preferred privacy. He hesitated, then shook his head and kept walking. Coincidences happened, but something about the moment stayed in his mind long after he drove away. Later that evening, Sophia texted him, "Running late tonight. Client presentation tomorrow." Jonathan read the message several times. Then he typed, "Good luck with the presentation." Her reply came quickly, "Thank you." Jonathan stared at the small red heart. The gesture should have comforted him. Instead, it felt strangely hollow. 2 days later, the truth finally began to reveal itself. Jonathan had returned home earlier than expected. The house was quiet. Sophia had told him she would spend the afternoon preparing a marketing proposal at a cafe. Jonathan walked into the kitchen and set his keys down. On the counter sat Sophia's tablet. The screen lit up suddenly with a message notification. Jonathan froze. He did not intend to read it, but the words appeared clearly before the screen dimmed. Michael. Last night was worth every risk. Jonathan felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. For several seconds, he simply stood there, staring at the darkened screen. Maybe the message meant something else. Maybe it was about a business deal. Maybe... His thoughts stopped. Because deep down, Jonathan already understood the truth. He picked up the tablet slowly. His hands were steady, almost too steady. The device required no password. Sophia trusted him. Or perhaps she simply believed he would never look. Jonathan opened the message thread, and the illusion of his marriage collapsed. The conversation stretched back weeks. Late-night messages, flirtation that gradually turned intimate, memories of secret dinners, jokes about Jonathan working late. Then the messages became more explicit. Meetings, hotel rooms, plans. One message from Michael stood out among the rest. He has no idea. Jonathan's chest tightened as if someone had wrapped a wire around his ribs. He kept reading. The evidence became impossible to ignore. Photos. Selfies taken in hotel mirrors. Sophia's smile in those photos was different from the one she gave Jonathan. Brighter, more reckless, more alive. Jonathan placed the tablet back on the counter. For a long time, he stood there in complete silence. Shock moved through him first, then jealousy, then a deep, almost physical pain. His best friend, his wife, the two people he trusted most. For a brief moment, rage surged through him. Images flashed in his mind, confrontations, accusations, violence. But Jonathan forced himself to breathe slowly. Anger would be easy, too easy. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen table. He needed to think, needed to understand how this had happened. When Sophia finally came home that evening, Jonathan was waiting. She stepped inside, surprised to see him already there. "Oh," she said, "you're home early." Jonathan studied her face carefully. For the first time in years, he felt like he was looking at a stranger. "Yeah," he replied calmly. Sophia set her purse down. "You look serious. Everything okay?" Jonathan folded his hands on the table. "We need to talk." Something in his voice made her pause. "What about?" Jonathan reached into his pocket and placed his phone on the table. On the screen was one of the messages he had photographed from the tablet. Michael's words, "Last night was worth every risk." Sophia's eyes flickered briefly, but her reaction came quickly.
What is that?
Jonathan held her gaze. "You tell me." She frowned. Michael sends weird messages sometimes. He jokes around. Jonathan remained silent. Sophia crossed her arms. You went through my messages? I saw the notification. So you invaded my privacy. The accusation came sharp and defensive. Jonathan felt the familiar urge to retreat, but this time he didn't. Sophia, he said quietly, are you sleeping with Michael? The room fell completely silent. Her face hardened. No. The answer came instantly. Too instantly. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. I read the messages. She shook her head. They're out of context. I saw the photos. Sophia's expression faltered. For the first time, fear flickered in her eyes. Jonathan's voice softened. Not angry, not shouting, just deeply wounded. I trusted both of you. Sophia looked away. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Jonathan said something she clearly didn't expect. I'm not here to scream at you. She looked back at him cautiously. What do you mean? Jonathan's voice trembled slightly now. Tell me the truth. Sophia said nothing. Jonathan continued. If our marriage still means anything to you, tell me the truth and we'll figure out what to do. A long silence followed. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows again. Sophia's breathing grew uneven. For a moment, Jonathan thought she might finally confess. Instead, she whispered, It's not what you think. Jonathan felt the last fragile piece of hope inside him begin to crumble, because the evidence was already undeniable. Yet the woman he loved was still trying to deny it, and somewhere deep inside Jonathan Carter, something fundamental began to change. The man who once trusted without question was slowly disappearing. In his place, someone colder, more deliberate, was beginning to emerge. The rain continued through the night. Seattle streets glistened under streetlights, the city wrapped in that familiar quiet melancholy that only rain could create. Inside the Carter house in Ballard, however, the calm rhythm of the city meant nothing. A marriage was cracking open in silence. Jonathan Carter sat at the kitchen table, the phone still lying between him and Sophia like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. Sophia had not touched it. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her posture defensive, her eyes avoiding his. It's not what you think, she repeated. Jonathan watched her carefully. The words sounded hollow now. You said that already, he replied quietly. Another long silence settled between them. Finally, Sophia exhaled sharply and ran a hand through her hair. You're blowing this out of proportion. Jonathan blinked slowly. Out of proportion? Yes, she said, her tone suddenly firmer. You read one message and jumped to conclusions. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. One message? He said softly. Sophia's eyes flickered. You were spying on my tablet. I saw the notification. That's the same thing. Jonathan felt a small, bitter realization forming. She was changing the focus, turning the accusation around. It was a tactic he had seen before in difficult negotiations with clients. Deflect, redirect, confuse. But hearing it from his own wife felt surreal. Sophia, he said calmly, I saw weeks of messages. She hesitated, just for a moment, but then she recovered quickly. Michael and I talk, she said. That's not a crime. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Talking doesn't usually involve hotel rooms. Her eyes widened. You misunderstood those. I saw the photos. Silence. For the first time, Sophia looked genuinely shaken, but instead of confessing, she did something else. She stood up. You know what? She said sharply. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Jonathan frowned. What are you talking about? You, she replied. Jonathan felt a chill run through him. What about me? Sophia gestured around the quiet house. This life, she said. It's suffocating sometimes. Jonathan stared at her. I work hard for this life. I know you do, she said quickly. But you're never here. Jonathan almost laughed. I'm never here? You're always working, she insisted. Always buried in blueprints or construction meetings. So that justifies this? I didn't say that. But you're implying it. Sophia looked frustrated now, pacing slowly across the kitchen floor. You don't understand how lonely it gets, she said. Jonathan's voice grew quieter. Lonely? Yes. The word lingered heavily in the air. For a moment, Jonathan remembered their early years together. Small apartments, late-night conversations, the way Sophia used to fall asleep on the couch while he sketched designs. Back then, loneliness had never been part of their story. But now she was using it like a weapon.
"You could have talked to me," Jonathan said. "I tried." "When?" She looked away. "You're always busy."
Jonathan felt something twist painfully in his chest. This was the moment many marriages collapsed into bitterness, two people rewriting history to justify the present. But Jonathan forced himself to stay calm. "I'm asking one question," he said quietly. "Are you having an affair with Michael?" Sophia's jaw tightened. "No." The word came out cold and sharp. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. The lie felt heavier now, because he already knew the truth. Over the next several days, the house became strangely quiet. Sophia behaved as if nothing had happened. She cooked dinner. She asked about Jonathan's projects. She even suggested they watch a movie together one evening. It was as if the confrontation had never occurred. Jonathan played along, but inside, something fundamental had changed. He watched more carefully now, listened more closely. And slowly, the deeper betrayal began to reveal itself. One evening, Jonathan woke up in the middle of the night. The bedroom was dark. Sophia wasn't in bed. He sat up. A faint light glowed from downstairs. Jonathan walked quietly down the hallway. Sophia stood in the living room near the window. Her back was turned to him. She was whispering into her phone. Jonathan froze. "I told you," she said softly. A pause. "No, he suspects something." Another pause. Sophia laughed quietly. "Relax. Jonathan isn't the confrontational type." Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. She continued speaking. "We just have to be more careful." Another pause. "Yes, I miss you too." Jonathan stood in the shadows of the hallway, completely still. Every word felt like a knife sliding deeper into his chest. Not only had Sophia lied to him, she was still seeing Michael, even after being confronted, even after he had offered her the chance to tell the truth. For several seconds, Jonathan considered stepping forward, confronting her right there. But something stopped him. Instead, he quietly returned upstairs, back to the bedroom, back to the empty space beside him in the bed. The next morning, Sophia acted perfectly normal. She kissed Jonathan goodbye before leaving for work. "Don't work too late," she said lightly. Jonathan forced a small smile. "I won't." The door closed behind her. Jonathan stood in the silent house for a long time. Now the truth was undeniable. The betrayal wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a choice, a continuing choice. And the most painful part was not the affair itself. It was the realization that Sophia believed he was too weak, too passive, to ever truly challenge her. Jonathan walked slowly to the kitchen window and looked out at the gray Seattle sky. For weeks he had hoped the confrontation might save their marriage, that Sophia might choose honesty, that Michael might step back out of respect for their friendship. But now those hopes were gone. In their place was something colder, clearer. Jonathan Carter was no longer a confused husband trying to understand what had happened. Now he was a man who understood exactly what he was dealing with. And the next step would no longer be about saving the marriage. It would be about justice. Quiet, careful, and devastating. Pain does not always destroy a person. Sometimes it reshapes them. For Jonathan Carter, the transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly over the following weeks, the way winter quietly settles over a city, one cold morning at a time. On the surface, nothing in his life appeared different. He still woke up at 6:30 every morning. He still drove through the damp Seattle streets to his architecture office downtown. He still returned home in the evening, greeted Sophia with a polite kiss, and asked about her day. To anyone observing from the outside, the Carters looked like a perfectly functional couple. But inside Jonathan, something fundamental had shifted. The man who once trusted instinctively now observed, carefully, silently. It began with attention. Jonathan started noticing patterns. Sophia's schedule, her late nights, the evenings when she claimed to have client meetings. He didn't confront her again. There was no point. He already knew the truth. Instead, Jonathan began writing things down. Dates, times, locations. lines. He kept a small notebook inside his desk drawer at the office. Each entry was brief and precise, the way an architect might record measurements for a structural inspection. Wednesday, 9:45 p.m. Sophia arrives home. Perfume unfamiliar. Friday, message notification from Michael while Sophia in shower. Sunday, claims marketing dinner. Location tag on social media shows downtown hotel. Jonathan hated himself slightly for doing it, but the alternative was worse. Living inside a lie. At the same time, his relationship with Michael Hayes continued outwardly unchanged. Michael still texted occasionally, still suggested drinks, still behaved like the confident, loyal friend he had always pretended to be. One evening, Michael invited Jonathan to a sports bar to watch a playoff game. Jonathan agreed. The bar was loud and crowded. Screens flashed highlights across every wall. Michael ordered 2 beers and slid one across the table. "Feels like we haven't hung out just the two of us in a while," he said. Jonathan nodded. "Work's been busy." Michael leaned back casually. "You always say that." Jonathan studied his friend quietly. Michael looked exactly the same as he always had, relaxed, charming, completely comfortable in his own skin. If Jonathan had not seen the messages himself, he might never have suspected anything. "You and Sophia seem to be getting along well lately," Jonathan said casually. Michael shrugged. "She's great company." "Yeah." Another pause. Michael took a drink. Jonathan watched him carefully. Not a single flicker of guilt crossed his face. The realization was almost more painful than the affair itself. Michael truly believed he would never be caught. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his home office long after Sophia had gone to bed. The room was dim except for the glow of his laptop. On the screen were the photos he had quietly copied from Sophia's tablet. Messages, pictures, dates, proof. Jonathan stared at them for a long time. Part of him wanted to erase everything, walk upstairs, pretend none of it had happened. But another voice inside him spoke more clearly now. Truth mattered, and truth had consequences. Over the following weeks, Jonathan expanded his quiet investigation. He learned things he had never wanted to know. Michael often stayed at a boutique hotel downtown when visiting Seattle. Sophia's late meetings frequently aligned with those visits. One evening, Jonathan even saw them together from across the street. They were leaving a restaurant. Michael placed his hand on the small of Sophia's back as they walked toward his car. The gesture looked intimate, natural, practiced. Jonathan remained inside his parked car, watching silently. He did not step out. He did not confront them. Instead, he turned the engine on and drove away. Because now he understood something important. Explosive anger would only give them control of the story. But patience could take that control away. Jonathan also began studying something else. Michael's business. The consulting firm that had made him wealthy. Michael often spoke proudly about his reputation among investors and startup founders. Trust, credibility, influence. In that world, image mattered almost as much as money. Jonathan leaned back in his chair one evening and considered the irony. Michael had risked everything for an affair he believed would remain hidden. And Sophia had risked her marriage for excitement she believed she deserved. Neither of them seemed to realize the fragile structure they were standing on. Jonathan understood structures. He knew exactly how they collapsed. Meanwhile, at home, Sophia seemed increasingly relaxed. Jonathan's silence reassured her. The confrontation weeks earlier had faded into memory. She believed she had regained control of the situation. One night during dinner, she even said casually, "I think things feel better between us lately." Jonathan looked up from his plate. "Do they?" Sophia smiled. "You seem calmer." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot." "About what?" "About what really matters." Sophia reached across the table and touched his hand. "I'm glad." Jonathan returned the smile politely. But inside, his mind was already moving several steps ahead. Late one evening, Jonathan stood on the balcony outside his office building overlooking downtown Seattle. The city lights shimmered across Elliott Bay. Cars moved slowly along wet streets below. For the first time since discovering the affair, his thoughts felt completely clear. This was no longer about anger, or jealousy, or even revenge. It was about something deeper, emotional justice. Sophia had believed she could betray him without consequences. Michael had believed he could destroy a friendship without losing anything. Both of them had mistaken Jonathan's quiet nature for weakness. That misunderstanding would soon prove very expensive. Jonathan checked his phone. An invitation email glowed on the screen. A prestigious business gala scheduled in 3 weeks. Michael Hayes would be one of the featured speakers. Sophia's marketing firm was also involved in the event. Jonathan stared at the invitation for a long moment. Then a slow, deliberate idea formed in his mind. The kind of idea that could only emerge from weeks of silence and observation. For the first time since everything began, Jonathan Carter allowed himself a small smile, because he finally knew exactly what he was going to do. The ballroom of the Cascade Grand Hotel glittered like a jewel above downtown Seattle. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, scattering warm golden light across rows of round tables draped in white linen. Waiters moved quietly between guests, carrying glasses of champagne, while the soft hum of conversation filled the enormous room. Tonight's event was one of the most anticipated gatherings of Seattle's business community. Venture capitalists, tech founders, corporate executives, architects, developers, and marketing firms. Everyone who mattered in the city's professional circles seemed to be present. At the center of the evening's program was a keynote speaker, Michael Hayes. His consulting firm had recently advised several high-profile technology startups, and his reputation as a charismatic strategist had made him something of a minor celebrity in the city's business world. Across the ballroom, Sophia Carter stood with several colleagues from her marketing firm, laughing lightly as they discussed the evening's event planning. Her company had helped organize the gala. She looked radiant, confident, perfectly composed. From the outside, she appeared to be a woman whose life was moving exactly as she had planned. What she didn't know was that the foundation beneath that image was about to collapse. At precisely 7:30 in the evening, Jonathan Carter stepped into the ballroom. He wore a dark, tailored suit, his posture calm and controlled. To anyone watching, he looked like any other guest arriving for a formal networking event. But inside, his mind moved with quiet precision. Every detail of the evening had been carefully considered, every step timed. Jonathan paused near the entrance and scanned the room. He spotted Sophia immediately. She was speaking with 2 executives from her firm, her smile bright and effortless. For a brief moment, Jonathan felt a familiar ache in his chest. There had been a time when that smile belonged to him. But tonight was not about nostalgia. Tonight was about truth. Michael Hayes stood near the stage, greeting guests with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to attention. When he saw Jonathan approaching, his expression lit up. "Jonathan," Michael said warmly, extending his hand. "I didn't know you were coming tonight." Jonathan shook his hand. "I received an invitation." Michael grinned. "Good. You'll finally get to hear one of my brilliant speeches. I'm looking forward to it." Michael glanced across the room toward Sophia. "She's here too, right?" Jonathan followed his gaze. "Yes." Michael nodded casually. "Great event. Her team did a fantastic job." Jonathan studied his friend's face for a moment. Still no guilt. Still no hesitation. It almost impressed him. A few minutes later, Sophia noticed Jonathan standing near the bar. Surprise flickered across her face. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said as she approached. "I decided at the last minute." She kissed his cheek lightly. "You look nice. So do you." Sophia glanced toward the stage where Michael was speaking with the event organizers. "He's nervous," she said with a smile. "Michael?" "Yes. Big audience tonight." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Very big." At 8 o'clock sharp, the lights dimmed slightly as the evening's program began. Guests took their seats. Waiters cleared the last glasses from the tables. The event host stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone with a brief introduction. Then he smiled and gestured toward the wings of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome tonight's keynote speaker, Michael Hayes." Applause filled the ballroom. Michael walked confidently onto the stage, adjusting the microphone as the crowd settled. He began speaking with his usual charm. Stories about entrepreneurship, insights into the future of technology, the importance of trust and partnerships in business. Jonathan listened from his table near the back of the room. The irony of Michael's words was almost unbearable. Trust, integrity, collaboration. Michael spoke about them as if he believed every word. Sophia watched proudly from a table near the front, clapping enthusiastically whenever the audience applauded. Jonathan remained still, waiting. 20 minutes into the speech, Michael reached the final section. And in business, he said confidently, reputation is everything. People invest not just in ideas, but in character. The audience nodded. Some guests murmured agreement. At that exact moment, Jonathan stood up. He walked calmly toward the stage. Several heads turned. Michael noticed him approaching and smiled slightly, assuming his friend was simply moving closer to watch. But Jonathan did not stop at the audience rows. He walked directly to the side of the stage. The event coordinator looked confused as Jonathan leaned toward her and spoke quietly. After a brief moment of hesitation, she handed him a small remote used to control the presentation screen behind Michael. Michael paused mid-sentence. "Jonathan?" he said with a puzzled smile. Jonathan stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. Sophia's expression shifted instantly from curiosity to confusion. "What are you doing?" Michael asked lightly. Jonathan took the microphone. His voice was calm, measured. "I apologize for interrupting the speech," he said to the audience. "But since Michael was speaking about trust and reputation, I thought it might be appropriate to share a small example." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Michael frowned. "Jonathan, what is this?" Jonathan didn't look at him. Instead, he pressed the remote. The massive screen behind them flickered. Then an image appeared, a screenshot of a message conversation. Michael's name, Sophia's name, and the unmistakable words, "Last night was worth every risk." The ballroom exploded into shocked whispers. Sophia went completely pale. Michael stared at the screen in horror. Jonathan pressed the remote again. Another image appeared, a photograph from a hotel mirror, Sophia and Michael together. More murmurs, more stunned faces. Jonathan finally turned to look at them. "I discovered several weeks ago," he said calmly, "that my wife and my best friend had been having an affair." The room fell into stunned silence. Sophia stood frozen near her table. Michael's face drained of color. Jonathan continued. "I confronted Sophia privately and gave her the chance to tell the truth. Instead, she chose to continue the relationship." Sophia shook her head weakly. "Jonathan, stop." But he continued speaking. "Michael also continued pretending to be my friend." Michael stepped forward. "This isn't the place." Jonathan raised a hand. "Oh, I disagree." He gestured toward the crowd of executives, investors, and business leaders. "This room is full of people who care deeply about trust and reputation." Another image appeared on the screen. More messages, more undeniable proof. Gasps spread through the audience. Michael's carefully polished public image shattered in real time. Sophia looked as if she might collapse. Jonathan lowered the remote. His voice remained steady. "I'm not here for revenge," he said quietly. "I'm here for the truth." The silence in the ballroom felt almost physical. Jonathan stepped away from the microphone. Then he looked at Michael one last time. "You once told me reputation was everything." Michael said nothing. Jonathan turned and walked calmly off the stage. Behind him, the room erupted into a storm of whispers. And in that moment, the lives Michael and Sophia had carefully constructed in Seattle's elite social world began to crumble. The silence that followed Jonathan's exit from the stage did not last long. At first, the ballroom of the Cascade Grand Hotel remained frozen in disbelief. Hundreds of guests sat motionless, staring at the massive screen that still displayed the final image of Michael Hayes and Sophia Carter together. Then the whispers began. Quiet at first, then louder. Small circles of executives leaned toward one another, murmuring in stunned voices. Phones began appearing in hands across the room as guests discreetly photographed the screen or typed hurried messages. In the modern world, reputation could collapse faster than a building demolition. All it took was one moment of undeniable truth. And Jonathan Carter had just delivered it in front of the most influential people in Seattle. On stage, Michael Hayes stood completely still. For a man who built his career on confidence and persuasive speech, he suddenly had nothing to say. The remote Jonathan had used still lay on the podium beside the microphone. The giant screen behind him continued displaying the evidence of the affair like a silent accusation. Michael stepped toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," but his voice lacked the smooth authority it once carried. The audience was no longer listening. Several investors were already standing up, speaking quietly among themselves. A few people shook their heads in visible disappointment. One venture capitalist near the front table whispered to his colleague, "That's the guy advising our startup?" His colleague frowned. "Not anymore." Michael heard the words. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. In his world, trust was currency. And tonight, that currency had just evaporated. Across the ballroom, Sophia Carter stood beside her table, trembling. Her colleagues from the marketing firm had stepped away slightly, unsure how to react. One of them whispered quietly, "Is it real?" Sophia felt every pair of eyes in the room turning toward her. She had spent years carefully building her professional image, confident, intelligent, composed. Now that image had shattered in seconds. Her phone vibrated repeatedly in her hand. Messages, notifications. The beginning of a digital storm she knew she would not survive unscathed. For the first time that night, the reality of her choices truly hit her. Jonathan had not shouted. He had not insulted her. He had not created a violent spectacle. He had simply told the truth. And that truth was far more devastating than any accusation. Meanwhile, Jonathan Carter had already left the ballroom. The cool Seattle night air greeted him as he stepped outside the hotel entrance. Rain had begun again, falling softly onto the city streets. Jonathan stood under the awning for a moment, breathing slowly. The storm inside him, the rage, the jealousy, the heartbreak, had dominated his thoughts for weeks. But now, something surprising had replaced it. Relief. The truth was no longer a secret he carried alone. He walked slowly down the wet sidewalk, the lights of downtown reflecting across the pavement. For the first time since discovering the affair, the weight on his chest felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. 3 days later, the consequences had fully begun. Seattle's professional circles moved quickly when scandal appeared. Michael Hayes woke to find several urgent emails waiting in his inbox. One investor had decided to reconsider their partnership. Another company had postponed a consulting contract. A third message was even shorter. Given recent events, we believe it would be best to pause collaboration. Michael stared at the screen in disbelief. Years of reputation, built through networking, persuasion, and trust, were unraveling within hours. His phone rang several times that morning. He didn't answer, because he already knew what the conversations would be about. Sophia's consequences came just as swiftly. Her marketing firm had called an emergency meeting. The company prided itself on professional credibility with high-end clients. A public scandal involving one of their senior employees, especially one tied to a major business gala, was a liability they could not ignore. By Friday afternoon, Sophia sat in a glass-walled conference room facing two partners from the firm. Their expressions were polite but distant. "This situation has created significant reputational challenges for the company," one of them explained carefully. Sophia's hands trembled in her lap. "I understand. We believe it would be best if you took an extended leave of absence." She knew what the words really meant. Her career in that firm was finished. That evening, Sophia returned to the Ballard house, the house she and Jonathan had once built together. It felt colder now, emptier. Jonathan was already there, sitting in the living room reading. Sophia stood in the doorway for several seconds before speaking. "Jonathan." He looked up calmly. "Yes." She stepped inside slowly. Her confidence, the armor she had worn for years, was gone. "I lost my job," she said quietly. Jonathan said nothing. Tears filled her eyes. "Michael's company is collapsing too." Still, Jonathan remained silent. Finally, she whispered the words she had avoided since the beginning. "I'm sorry." The apology sounded fragile, small. Jonathan studied her face. For weeks, he had imagined this moment. Her regret, her realization, her pain. But when it finally arrived, he did not feel triumph, only clarity. "I offered you a chance to tell the truth," he said gently. Sophia nodded weakly. "I know. You chose not to. I was afraid." Jonathan stood and walked to the window. Rain slid down the glass outside. "I loved you," he said quietly. Sophia's voice broke. "I know." A long silence passed between them. Finally, Jonathan turned back toward her. "I've already filed the divorce papers." Sophia closed her eyes. The words landed like a final verdict. "Is there any chance?" "No." Jonathan's answer was calm, not cruel, just final. He walked past her toward the hallway. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I truly hope you learned something from this." Then he left. Several weeks later, Jonathan stood once again on the balcony outside his office. Seattle's skyline stretched before him beneath a pale winter sun. Life had not magically become perfect. Divorce was painful. Betrayal left scars. But something essential had returned to him: his dignity, his control, his sense of self.
Jonathan Carter had entered the ordeal as a wounded husband. He emerged as something stronger. Not a victim, not a man consumed by revenge, but a man who understood his own worth. And sometimes, that realization was the most powerful victory of all.